If you were a part of a research study conducting disability simulations that required you to use a wheelchair as your form of mobility, or wear goggles that impaired your vision, how do you think you would feel in the end? Maybe misunderstood, or angry or resentful? Well, that's what I'm discussing today with my guest, Dr. Michelle Nario-Redmond, professor of psychology at Hiram College in Ohio. She conducted a study to test the effects of able bodied people when they simulated having a disability for a day. Now, if you're familiar with the book Black Like Me, published in 1961, the simulation may cause you to wince a little. But I invite you to continue learning as we explore this topic in the realm of disabilities. Dr. Nario-Redmond is the author of the book Ableism, The Causes and Consequences of Disability Prejudice, and she has been an ardent supporter of disability inclusion for years. That interview is coming up next. Welcome to the show. I am here speaking with Dr. Michelle Nario-Redmond, professor of psychology at Hiram College. Doctor, how are you? Thanks for being here.
I'm great. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was just reading over your research that you did a few years ago talking about disabilities, and it's titled Crip for a Day, The Unintended Negative Consequences of Disabilities Simulations. And you've done quite a bit of research, quite frankly, in the area of disabilities and people's perceptions and things like that of people with disabilities. However, you're in the you're a professor of psychology in general. So I'm just curious, as a background measure, what got you into focusing a lot of your research in the area of disabilities?
So I'm a social psychologist, and social psychologists tend to study things like who do you love, why do we hate, and the biggest area of social psychology is stereotyping and prejudice, and that's my specialty subfield. But when I was in graduate school, very few people were studying disabled people as a minority group, even though they are the largest minority group in the United States. 1 out of 5, 1 out of 4, according to the CDC. So that didn't seem to bother me. I mean, I was happily studying gender and race related issues and sexuality and age related stereotypes and so forth. But it wasn't until 1995 when I had my first child, a daughter named Sierra Grace, that I became aware of how pervasive disability is because it happened in my family. So her birth was unanticipated in terms of her condition. She was born with spina bifida and is now 24, almost 25 years old, has graduated college, is now a teacher herself of little preschool kids. And it wasn't until, again, she was born that I was sort of like, why didn't I think about this group of people who are also folks that confront all kinds of bias, misperceptions, and who people want to help. And it's not always negative prejudice or hostility, but sometimes it's overly patronizing, pity reactions that we also confronted as young parents with her. And so it really became kind of a personal meets professional coup because I saw that there was a huge opportunity to extend my field of stereotyping and prejudice to include the stereotypes about this huge group of people who are misunderstood. And I began hoarding the literature on prejudice, and one day decided, I should do something with all of these articles. And that's what gave birth to this book that I recently wrote on ableism. But that's basically how I became really enthralled with the subject of disability studies.
Well, your study, I mean, it's not, I mean, I don't know in the world, in the world of research, whether it's considered a new, relatively recent study in the law. Anything 3 years old is recent. But it's a study that was done in 2017 where you looked at disability simulations. So I'd like to just start out with what are disability simulations? What do you mean by that?
Yes, and so I'll tell you, this has an interesting backstory too, because I was never a big fan of disability simulations, although I knew they existed. And what they are, like any other sort of simulation, they give people supposedly an insider's view of what it might be like to, say, have low vision. People are curious, and these simulations have been around for a long time as building exercises or as even fun activities for kids who under the guise of disability awareness. And so folks have often expressed curiosity and interest, which is a good thing. And I think without people doing much research on whether or not these actually do improve disability awareness or attitudes or reduce bias or reduce prejudice was always an open question. So people would go around and as part of their diversity day at work, perhaps they might wear a pair of goggles or a pair of glasses that had Vaseline. And they were told, well, this is what it's like to experience low vision. Or another type of simulation, very common, is to roll around in a wheelchair and to be told, this is what it's like to experience paralysis or a physical mobility issue. Why don't you check this? Other disability simulations in the schools that teachers will often encounter and also perpetuate with their own students have to do with learning disabilities. And so a popular stereotype about people with dyslexia, for example, is that they experience words on a page in a jumbled fashion, and it's kind of like reading backwards. And so someone had the bright idea to give people text written backwards, and as a simulation say, well, now you know what it's like to, and the frustrations that people who have dyslexia experience. And so earlier, I think it was 2000, maybe 15, or a couple of years even before that, my school, like many other schools during Disability Awareness Week, decided to stage some simulations in the dining hall. The resident directors wanted to raise awareness and do a fun activity. And while I shared some information about how these are often mischaracterizing of the disability experience and can maybe perpetuate harm, there wasn't a lot of evidence that I had at my fingertips about this. And so I decided maybe instead of fighting the battle, to use this as an opportunity to actually assess before and after. When college kids go into the dining hall to get their trays in their wheelchairs, or they're asked to put earphones on, or earplugs, I should say, and simulate deafness, what we did is we took the opportunity to give them a set of measures in advance of them doing these college produced simulations out of student life. And then afterwards, we asked them some of the same questions. And this was the first attempt at trying, at least in my research domain, to assess systematically, did attitudes in fact improve? What did people say their experiences were in an open-ended way? Did they feel like they understood the experience better? And what was their mood? Did they feel joyful? Did they feel angry or frustrated? And so that's kind of how this started. And once we did that first study and saw that we were documenting some negative unintended consequences, then we did a more systematic lab experiment where we had different college students simulating up to 3 different disabilities. And we caveated all of this by saying this may not actually represent what the experience of disability is like, but we know these activities are out there in terms of promoting disability awareness. And so we just told subjects that we were interested in their perceptions. And so that was the second study.
And so let's get more into the one that you conducted, the one that was a little bit more robust. What were some of the simulations that you did?
So when we did the lab experiment, the second study, we replicated the simulations from the dining hall that the students, and these were also very popular, but we also wanted a control for differences between the simulations. So we used one common 500-word paragraph that was kind of just about how to get from point A to point B in the Hiram, Ohio area. And so that paragraph was used to simulate low vision by giving people these special goggles that you could buy to simulate a particular low vision status where it was very difficult to see out of them. It was very blurry. And so someone would read to them, or they would read, I should say, they would read the paragraph through these blurry goggles to simulate low vision. Then the same paragraph would be read to them while they had special earplugs and noise canceling headphones on, same content, but they would be listening to it. And then again, for the third simulation, we had them do this popular dyslexia. The paragraph was written backwards. And so participants would have to try to read that same directional paragraph backwards to simulate this learning disability, dyslexia. So those were the three that we did more systematically.
Now, since there had been prior studies beforehand that you read about, did you hypothesis and assume the same conclusion would that your study would render the same conclusion, or did you have a different one?
Well, I guess and we had to hypothesize in advance what we expected. So because of those previous studies, we expected that attitudes would be negative. But we focused on some of the attitude measures that were really robust, reliable, and had been validated in other studies, like the interaction with disabled people scale. So that one particularly focuses on your willingness to, have dinner with someone with a visible disability or date them. And so specifically social interaction attitudes. And we did expect those to be negative based on previous studies. I also expected, and this was somewhat speculative, that people might even stereotype themselves. That was an area that I had studied. What are the beliefs about disabled people as a group? And they are thought to be stereotyped as incompetent, dependent, asexual. And so I was curious if we gave people a list of adjectives before and after they simulated these three impairments, would they feel less competent? Would they feel more dependent? Which is also what we found. And those, we created the measures for those based on my disability stereotypes book. And then we were interested in temporary mood shifts. So we gave folks the validated PALMS instrument, which is a mood scale where people say how frustrated, hostile, angry, active, happy they felt, these different moods. And that we predicted more of the negative moods would increase from baseline. And I think we also even had some behavioral intention measures, which we were interested in whether people would be willing. If you're understanding the disability experience, then maybe people would be more likely to want to help make a campus more accessible after they participated. So we had some exploratory measures.
Okay, so you talked a little bit about some of the ultimate results in your findings. Were they all negative? Like, I know in terms of changes in mood and you tested changes in self stereotypes. What were ultimately when you say the results were negative? What do you mean by that, and what results did you find?
I think the way we typically summarize the main takeaway points is that in terms of mood, people felt more hostile. They felt more frustrated in terms of their moods. They felt less vigorous. Vigor was one of the emotion-based words. So it was somewhat energy draining to do these activities. And then in terms of the stereotypes, they felt less competent, consistent with the research. They felt more dependent. They felt more helpless. I think I mentioned frustration. And then their attitudes. We took an index of this interactions with disabled people scale. Those attitudes were more negative afterwards. And particularly, people were more afraid of themselves becoming disabled in the future, which is what theoretically we're speculating may be driving these negative effects. And I know you want to talk about perspective taking too, but there is some notion that when you take the perspective, when you simulate someone else's experience, when you're really having, an experience that you think is the disability experience activated, is that somehow becoming more of a distress, that it could be me. This is a group that anyone can join. Anyone can become traumatically brain injured after an injury. Anyone can become paralyzed after an accident. People temporarily lose limbs or break arms and legs. And so I began to speculate that perhaps instead of imagining what it's like for the other person, what's happening is that they're actually perceiving that this could be happening to them. And research has established that when people imagine themselves in these precarious circumstances, they can experience personal distress, maybe even guilt. And so,
Okay, so just to back up a bit, this experiment took place on campus, where the on campus, and I mean, I'm assuming a controlled environment, but I guess ultimately what I'm wondering is, when you say that some of the results, or the results had negative consequences, and some of those results included feelings of anger or feeling incompetent, I'm wondering, to the extent the students were on campus interacting with, non-disabled peers, um, do you think the students in the simulations were internalizing their external environment? So maybe they were feeling angry or incompetent because they were assuming also that other people viewed them in a certain negative manner, so they then internalized those feelings.
it's possible. These were undergrads, and so they were, I'm trying to wrap my head around your question. They may have, especially if they experienced distress, which we didn't measure directly other than those mood measures, they presumably were taking on what this is like. That was the instruction, that this is what it's like. In fact, they even said afterwards in the open-ended responses, well, now I get it. Now I know what that's like, which to me is actually more dangerous, because they don't necessarily get what it's like to have a quality life and live in an accessible space and cope after years of adjustment. But they certainly may have taken on temporarily.
So what do you think that we as a society could learn and take away ourselves from the research?
I think that it's important that we recognize that people are really curious. They want to understand, especially if they're made aware, I think, that this is a group that we can all join. What might it be like? When women get pregnant and we go try on maternity clothes, they give us the pillows to shove under the dress. And I remember doing that myself, thinking, I'll never be this big. And, what is that going to be like? And that's going to be so odd. But you really don't know what it's going to be like necessarily until you're there. And we want to accommodate people's interests. There are all kinds of alternatives to simulations, that if you're interested in disability as a life choice, as a way of being in the world and moving, talk to people with disabilities, ask questions. Even for little kids, I often tell parents, don't yank your kid away when they approach someone with a visible disability at the store, because that signals to that child that's something to be avoided. That's something to be ashamed about. We don't want to make people embarrassed, which, by the way, embarrassment was another thing that we found increased significantly when people simulate. So I want to acknowledge that disability awareness can be all kinds of interesting things. Awareness of the fact that disabled people have a culture, awareness of the fact that disabled people make a very large voting bloc but are still systematically disenfranchised when voting places are inaccessible. Making people aware that disabled people aren't asexual. They're sexual beings. There may be some that identify as asexual, just like in the general population. But people don't tend to, even medical professionals don't tend to recognize when their patients with visible disabilities are sexual beings and may fail to test for pregnancy or STDs. And so I think it's important to raise awareness. But increasingly, because people, educators, maybe diversity professionals who want to engage their employees in fun activities, I think we need to make folks aware that, you know, we don't paint our faces black anymore, like the famous book Black Like Me, to understand the Black experience. You know, we talk, we read, we find out what it means to be an anti-racist. We read insider biographies, or there's all kinds of blogs by famous disabled activists and scholars and performance artists that we can tap into. And we can also, I think, even recover some simulations that may give people a window into the barriers that people that use different forms of equipment face, so that they become aware, like they often do when they're temporarily disabled and have to use crutches. Oh my gosh, why doesn't that push button door work? You know, I'm carrying these crutches. Now I see why it's important to make sure these things are maintained. So it's different than appropriating the identity. To be able to use a piece of equipment. When my daughter was little, her friends always wanted to try her sporty wheelchair, and you know, she would charge them a quarter and say, okay, you can use it. And they often experience like exhilaration by, you know, going downhill and saying, well, this is kind of cool. Nowhere were they told, this is what my experience is like as someone who's born with this condition. But they at least got to see, oh, this can be tricky if you don't have upper body strength, but it can also be a lot of fun. And you can, you know, shoot a basket by, you know, lowering the basketball pole. It's not always about changing the person with the disability. You can change the environment. So I do think people need ways of connecting with this community in ways that increase understanding as opposed to misunderstanding. And we want to avoid the kinds of things that we see coming out of these simulations and other interactions with disabled people where people want to help. It's almost like, oh my gosh, you're triggering my stereotypes of this dependent society's legitimate dependence. Let me help roll your airline bag through the airport for you.
Well, Professor, I appreciate your time and doing this interview with me. This has been great.
It's been my pleasure. It really has been. Thank you for the opportunity to share information.
Absolutely. Thank you.